Most woodworking projects tend to involve gluing up a panel at some point or other during the project, whether that's tabletop, side of a cabinet, or a drawer bottom box, floating panel, something like that. The tricky thing with gluing up a panel is getting the pressure just right so that the boards don't buckle under pressure, so everything's drawn together, and that there's no vertical inconsistencies when the panels tend to shift between each board. Now, for larger panels, tabletops, that sort of thing, you can certainly use a domino, dowels, or biscuits to restrict vertical alignment. They work really well at that. The domino, biscuit, whatever, stops the two boards from being able to slip. You might have it on an elongated hole so that you can move horizontally for adjustment, but no vertical movement. But it is an extra step, and if you plan on trimming the panel afterwards, you have to be careful about the placement so that you don't expose them when it's actually cut. As you get to thinner panels, you can't really use dominoes or biscuits as they end up being thicker than the material that you're working with. And in the case of biscuits, if they're too close to the faces of the board, they can actually telegraph through. What happens is the biscuit absorbs the moisture from the glue, and that will cause it to swell, and it'll actually pop or raise the wood in a noticeable way if it's too close to the edge of the surface, and you really don't want that on a panel. You can see here with this clamped together, I've got a bit of flex as the whole thing is bending up. And one of the best solutions to this is cauls, specifically cambered cauls. These cauls have a very slight bow to them, or camber to them. As you apply clamping pressure to the outside, where it is narrower, it applies more pressure to the middle of the glue up as the cauls will flex. These are really easy to make. They'll take about 15 minutes depending on which way you make them, and they can be made from scrap material. There's nothing really fancy about it, just a bit of a trick to getting the camber right. The key, however, is to make them before you actually need to do a glue up.
It seems a little counterintuitive to make the wood perfectly flat, just to add a bow in later, but I find it nicer to work with square stock. The caul is roughly 25mm thick by about 35mm tall to fit underneath my clamps. The cauls are just for smaller panels, so I'm cutting them to about 450mm. To overcomplicate these clamps, I'm adding dovetail slots so that when it's used with clamps, the clamps will stay in place before tightening. First a 5/16 of an inch relief groove, then the 1/2 inch dovetail bit to complete the groove for the clamps. Next the dovetail is ripped off so it can be flipped and glued back on, and totally not because I forgot how the clamps work. The dovetail sections are then flipped and glued back on using some liquid hide glue. Funnily enough, if I had cauls, this would be a good time to use them to make sure everything lined up nicely. This is where the trick for making cambered cauls lies. First, mark the middle of the caul. Next, mark about 70mm away from the centre point on both sides. I'm going to continue marking 70mm from each line to demonstrate, but they'll be planed off. Except for the centre line, take 1 or 2 plain shavings from each lines towards the ends of the board, starting from the middlemost lines. Redraw lines as necessary. While it might not seem like a lot of material is removed, when the two cambered faces are combined, you can see a fair bit of an arc. To make the cauls stand out from raw timber, so I don't accidentally use them on other projects, I'm giving them a coat of tung oil. Once the tung oil is dry, we want to protect the cauls from glue. Nobody wants to stick their cauls to the actual project. One option is to use wax, another is to use pack-in tape. Both work well. The tape may be a bit flaky, but it is instant to apply. On the other hand, the wax is going to take a little longer to dry but can't easily fall off, though will need to be reapplied from time to time.
To actually use the cauls, first put your workpiece in its clamps. Just snug the clamps up. I'm using parallel clamps here. Pipe clamps will obviously work as well. These cauls are sized to fit underneath my parallel clamps, so you may need to adjust depending on your pipe clamps. Then you'll put your caul over top of it, on both sides of it. You can preload the clamps if you like, put them into one side and slide the whole caul underneath, or not. Really depends on what you want to do, and that's part of the reason why I went with the match fit clamp, so I had that flexibility. Slide the clamps in. You want the caul as centered as possible for the best distribution of pressure. Snug up both sides and then tighten them at the same time. Then you can also tighten up your actual clamping clamps, and then you've got a nice smooth panel which should remain pretty darn flat. If you don't have the match fit clamps, I am not sponsored by Micro Jig or anything like that. I just happen to really like them for a lot of the jigs and accessories that I make. You could definitely use a track saw clamp, just need to figure out how you'd make the groove for that, or just plain F clamps. I might find that these cauls are a little bit too wide for some things, so I might come back and add F clamps in a little bit closer to apply a bit more pressure. But as you can see, I'd need to raise the parallel clamps up, which I can put a spacer underneath either the workpiece or the clamps. Ideally, I might even make a few different lengths of cauls for that exact situation where I don't want to use F clamps, so I don't have to raise the whole assembly up. Either way, hopefully your next panel assembly will be nice and flat, because these cauls are super simple to make. They don't take very long, and they're a good general workshop accessory. Thanks for watching.